Hi everyone, my greetings to all of you. My name is YJ Rao. I have worked as an aircraft maintenance technician for 29 years with Indian Airlines and Air India. During that time, I had hands-on experience on HS-748, Boeing 737, Airbus 300 and A320 aircrafts. Later, I served for 9 years as an aircraft maintenance engineering instructor and a nodal officer in the Telangana State Aviation Academy. I am sure many of you are aware of the tragic Air India Flight 171 accident that occurred in Ahmedabad on June 12, 2025. The crash took the lives of 260 people. I am praying God to bless their souls with peace and my heartfelt condolences to their families. Aircraft Accident Investigation Bureau, which is also known as AAIB, released a preliminary report regarding this accident. The information given in this report based on two sources. One is the data collected by investigators from on-site visit, and another one is data from EAFR. EAFR full form is Enhanced Airborne Flight Recorder. Many models of aircrafts have two units. One is TFDR, another is CVR. That is Digital Flight Data Recorder and Cockpit Voice Recorder. DFDR records all the information regarding aircraft attitude and engine performance. CVR records all the sounds heard in cockpit. EAFR is the single unit which combines the functions of the both units DFDR and CVR. This EAFR is the one installed in 787 model aircrafts. These units are also known as black boxes. By this time, all of you must have gone through the preliminary report. So, I will go straight to the possible causes for engine shutdown resulting ultimately in flight crash. Before that, let us see what happened during the time between takeoff and crash. Here, I will mention Indian Standard Time only because accident has taken place in India. According to the EAFR data, the aircraft became airborne at 1300 hours 38 minutes 39 seconds. Just 3 seconds later, both the fuel control switches were moved to the cutoff position with a 1 second gap between the two. The report does not specify which switch was moved first, but based on other details, we can infer that number 1 engine fuel control switch was turned off first, followed by the number 2 engine fuel control switch. This action cut off fuel to both engines. This indicates that one engine was shut down 3 seconds after takeoff and the second engine 4 seconds after takeoff, resulting in total loss of engine power. The aircraft began losing altitude quickly. Then, 10 seconds after first fuel control switch moved to cutoff position, the number 1 engine fuel control switch was moved back to the run position. The engine relit and the RPM started increasing. After 4 seconds, number 2 engine control switch was also moved to run position, but it failed to pick up RPM immediately. 15 seconds after that, at 1300 hours 39 minutes 11 seconds, the EAFR stopped recording, indicating the aircraft has crashed. That means the crash occurred just 30 seconds after takeoff, and the aircraft managed to climb to an altitude of around 625 feet by that time. If few more seconds time was available before crash, at least number 1 engine would have developed thrust enough to pull the aircraft, with which help the pilots would have saved the situation, because one engine itself is capable of pulling the aircraft. But jet engines require a little bit time to develop full thrust, and unfortunately here the time was not available. Now, here is a question that arises. If both fuel control switches could be moved from run to cutoff within a second gap, why did it take 4 seconds to move the number 2 switch back to run after the number 1 engine fuel control switch was moved? That too in an emergency situation, especially when both engines have lost power and there is little time to act. Every second counts here. The aircraft has not climbed beyond 625 feet, and any delay in restarting the engines drastically reduces the chances of recovery. Another question is, if it really requires a 4-second gap between the switches during restart, how were they turned off so quickly within a second gap in the first place? The report also mentioned about the brief conversation between the pilots, which occurred within the 10-second gap between the number 1 engine fuel control switch moved to the cutoff position and back to run. That conversation is not much, but only 2 dialogues. That is, one pilot asked, "Why did you cut off?" and another pilot responded, "I did not." However, the report does not identify which pilot asked the question and which one responded. Now, let us see how the engines are shut down. Number 1 is fuel contamination. Number 2 is by closing the fuel supply valves. First, we will see the fuel contamination issue. Pilots, after starting the engines, they will allow them to run for some time in idle position, allowing them to stabilize and to check engine parameters are satisfactory. If fuel is contaminated, even before starting taxiing, engines will shut down. Here, aircraft has taxied out and airborne also. So, the fuel contamination is out of question. Now, we will see fuel valves closing. These fuel supply valves can be closed by 3 methods. One is someone physically moving the fuel control switches to the cutoff position. Second one is the fire extinguisher switches were operated, which automatically cuts the fuel supply. Third one is a software malfunction. There is a fourth one also, and this is a far-fetched guess. The switches somehow moved to cut off on their own. Now, in my 30 years in aviation industry, I have never seen or heard of a fuel control switch moving on their own. But I suppose there is always a first time for everything. Now, let us see the fire extinguisher switches issue. Whenever there is engine fire warning comes in the cockpit, the pilots immediately operate the concerned switch. This operation will close the fuel supply valve first, cutting off the fuel to engines. But the report makes no mention of any fire extinguisher switch being used, so we can rule that out. Next, let us talk about the possibility of software problem. Before going into details, I want to mention 2 incidents. The first incident happened in 2019 with All Nippon Airways flight NH985. Both engines shut down just before landing. And here is the key point: it happened without any command from pilots. After an investigation, the National Transportation Safety Board concluded that the shutdown was caused by a software issue. Following that, Boeing took corrective measures to fix the software problem. The second incident happened in January 2025 with United Airlines flight UA 613. While in flight, the aircraft suddenly descended 185 feet and then climbed back 200 feet on its own, again with no input from the pilots. In this case, the root cause is still unknown, but it is another example where automation may have played a role. So, for those who are aware of these 2 events, it is reasonable to wonder whether a software issue could have contributed to the Air India 171 accident as well. Now, let us look at the software angle. If there was truly a software problem, the system would send signal to the fuel supply valves to close, effectively cutting off fuel to the engines. But the fuel control switches in the cockpit would still remain in the run position because software cannot physically move those switches. Since these switches are not connected physically to any other components, only wires are connected and the wires carry only signals. But in the case of AI 171, the EAFR data clearly shows that the fuel control switches were moved to the cutoff position, and only then did the engine exhaust gas temperature begin to drop, which indicates engines are shut down. This indicates the software problem is not in the picture. Now, let us explore the possibility that someone physically moving the switches to the cutoff position. The pilots touch them during engine start or shutdown procedures, but never in flight. Aircraft engineers also handle them, that is, only during ground testing of engines. In this case, the preliminary report shows that according to EFR data, the fuel control switches were moved to cutoff position within 3 seconds after takeoff. This means that someone in the cockpit had to manually move both the switches immediately after liftoff. Now, let us talk about something that has been circulating in electronic media and social platforms. Some experts are speculating that the captain might have moved the fuel control switches to the cutoff position. These suspicions seem to be based on preliminary report. The preliminary report clearly mentions that at the time of takeoff, the first officer was flying the aircraft while the captain was monitoring. That means the first officer was holding the control column, managing the aircraft's climb, while the captain's hands were free, potentially allowing him to access and operate the fuel control switches. This is where someone have gone further, suggesting that the captain may have been suicidal, reportedly unable to recover from depression due to domestic issues. As an example, they are drawing comparisons to other past incidents, such as the Germanwings flight crash and the Egypt Air crash, where pilot suicide was suspected or confirmed. However, we must be very cautious with such comparisons. Those earlier tragedies occurred while aircrafts were at cruise altitudes, tens of thousands of feet in the air. From such an altitude, if a crash takes place, there is no chance of survival. But in the case of Air India 171, the aircraft had just taken off and climbed to only 625 feet before it crashed. At that altitude, there is no guarantee of 100% fatal outcome. In fact, in some cases, emergency action could potentially save some of those on board, depending on how quickly the situation is handled. Unfortunately, out of 242 passengers, including crew on board, 241 died. Only one passenger survived. Here, what I personally think, if a pilot truly intended to crash the aircraft to commit suicide, he would likely to do it after reaching higher altitude, not just 3 seconds after takeoff. So, while the suspicion exists, it is important to remember that the final investigation report has not yet been released, and jumping to conclusions at this stage may be unfair to the crew and families involved. But let us assume, for the sake of argument, that a pilot did intentionally move the fuel control switches to the cutoff position. These switches are located on the central pedestal, placed there so that either pilot can easily access them. Now, according to the EAFR data, there was a 1 second gap between the movement of the two switches. So, if it was done by one person, that person would have to move their hand from the first switch to the second one, lift the switch, and then move the second switch to cut off, all within 1 second, and do it slowly, discreetly, so as not to alert the other pilot. To really confirm if this is physically possible, investigators need to test this in a simulator or aircraft cockpit. If it is proven that 1 second is not enough, then we do have to assume that both switches were moved simultaneously using both hands. To operate both switches at a time, the pilot would need to turn his upper body almost 90 degrees because both switches are side by side on the center pedestal. But during takeoff, pilots are strapped in with seat belts and shoulder harnesses, focused on the instrument panel and the runway and outside, and they typically do not move their bodies sideways at all. So if one pilot suddenly turns to the side and reaches out with both hands, it would almost certainly be noticed by the other pilot. It is a highly unusual movement, and in such critical phase of flight, any unexpected motion would naturally attract the attention of other pilot, and he may ask, "What are you doing?" But here is the key detail. According to the EAFR, one pilot is heard asking, "Why did you cut off?" and the other responds, "I did not." So if both pilots are denying it, who moved the switches? Could the switches have somehow moved on their own? Let us explore that possibility next. Now let us talk about something important that ties into this discussion. A bulletin issued by the Federal Aviation Administration, known as FAA in the United States. Back on December 17th, 2018, the FAA released a special airworthiness information bulletin, also known as SAIB. The specific bulletin was with the number NH-18-33. Now let me quickly explain the difference. A SAIB is advisory in nature. It is a common recommendation, not mandatory. If something must be followed, the FAA issues what is called an airworthiness directive, or AD. So what did this particular SAIB say? It was issued after some Boeing 737 aircraft owners reported to Boeing that the locking mechanism on the fuel control switches was disengaged on some of their aircrafts. In response, the FAA issued this SAIB to alert aircraft owners and operators, especially of certain Boeing 737 models, about the potential for fuel control switches to move without being lifted as they should be. Now, based on the information available at the time, the FAA did not consider this to be an unsafe condition that required immediate action. So, they issued a SAIB rather than an AD. The bulletin also included a list of aircraft models and specific part numbers of the fuel control switches of those models. Interestingly, the Boeing 787, the model involved in the Air India 171 accident, was also mentioned in that list. The FAA advised owners and operators of these aircrafts to check whether the switches could be moved without lifting, and if such switches are found, they should be replaced as soon as possible. Specifically, FAA suggested replacing switches with an updated version that had an improved locking feature for certain 737 models. For other models, including the 787, the FAA did not issue any mandatory replacement, but Boeing had informed the FAA that the design of the fuel control switches and their locking mechanisms was the same across various models. Now, here is a point mentioned in the preliminary report of the Air India 171 crash. It says that Air India had not carried out this inspection on the aircraft involved in the accident in Ahmedabad, since the SAIB is only advisory and not mandatory. From SAIB, we can understand something very important. If the locking feature on the fuel control switches is disengaged, the switches can be moved without lifting, which means they can be accidentally bumped or shifted from the run position to the cutoff position, and that would shut down the engines. Reading this SAIB brings up a question. Could Could the aircraft involved in the accident have had fuel control switches with disengaged locking features? Let us look at some facts. The crashed Boeing 787 was manufactured in 2013, that is 5 years before the FAA issued this SAIB in 2018. That means it is very likely that the aircraft was originally fitted with switch, possibly the one prone to locking feature disengagement. In routine maintenance, switches are replaced from time to time, but with same part number switches, unless the manufacturer or aviation regulating authorities officially recommend a new part number. After the accident, DGCA, the Civil Aviation Regulating Authority of India, has ordered the inspection of the switches on all aircrafts. Air India carried out the inspection and declared all are perfect. But what about the crashed aircraft? It will be known only after inspection of the switch if the switches survived the crash and the fire. So another valid question: would not pilots or maintenance engineers notice if the locking feature was not working properly? Well, that is not guaranteed. Please note, pilots and engineers operate these switches properly, always following the procedure. That means they lift the switch before moving it. They would never try to move it without lifting. So even if the locking feature was disengaged, they may never notice it unless they were specifically instructed to check for it. So here is the key question: if both pilots did not touch the fuel control switches and yet they moved to the cutoff position, could this have happened due to a locking feature failure? That is certainly a possibility. But here is the thing: even in the Boeing 737s, where this disengagement condition was reported, there has been no known case where switches moved on their own and caused engine shutdown. So if that happened here, it would be the first ever recorded incident of its kind. Could it be that the spring mechanism, the one that holds the switches in place, had become weak or dislodged over time? Maybe. Due to vibrations during the takeoff roll, the switches slowly moved toward the cutoff position and reached it exactly as the aircraft lifted off. Again, this too has never been heard of before. But as I mentioned earlier, for everything there is a first time. And perhaps, unfortunately, this aircraft was the one in which the first time such a rare combination of mechanical failure and timing occurred. Now, there is one more issue I would like to touch upon: the thrust levers. According to the EAFR data, the thrust levers were still in takeoff thrust position at the time of impact. But when investigators examined the wreckage, they observed that the levers were found in the idle position. So what could have caused this discrepancy? Well, two possibilities come to mind. The levers may have moved to idle position due to the force of impact, or the pilot holding the levers may have instinctively pulled back his hand in self-protection as a reflex action at the moment of impact, causing the levers to move back unintentionally. At this stage, we don't know if there was any other cause for this mismatch. So until we receive the final report from the Aircraft Accident Investigation Bureau, we should refrain from blaming either the pilots, the airline, or the aircraft manufacturer for the loss of 260 lives, as well as the aircraft and property. Now, before we wrap up, I would like to say a few words that go beyond this specific incident. Whenever a new aircraft model is designed, it goes through extensive scrutiny. Prototypes are built, numerous tests and simulations are conducted, and during production, strict checks are enforced at every stage. And well-trained pilots fly the aircrafts, highly skilled engineers perform the maintenance. And yet, despite of all this, we still see occasional accidents and incidents, sometimes due to causes no one ever expected. Here are few examples. Aloha Airlines Flight 243 incident on April 28, 1988. Egypt Air Flight MS-990 accident on October 31st, 1999. Alaska Airlines Flight 261 accident on January 31st, 2000. German Wings Flight 9525 accident on March 24th, 2015. All Nippon Airways Flight NH985 incident on January 17th, 2019. And United Airlines Flight UA613 incident on January 24th, 2025. All of these were not caused by bad weather, and yet they still happened, even when everything seemed to have been done right. Why? Because at the end of the day, aircrafts are handled by human beings, not by robots or gods. And as humans, we are not perfect. Let me be very clear. My intention in sharing all of this is not to create fear about flying, but to bring forward some facts. Air travel is and continues to be the safest mode of transportation in the world. So, thank you for listening. I hope this video helps you understand this tragic incident in a little better. Let us wait for the final investigation report before drawing conclusions. And most importantly, let us honor and remember the lives lost in that accident. Namaste.